Well, thank you very much. Hoping to spend a fair amount of time talking about what a forward-looking agenda on some of these issues might look like. But one thing I've learned as a magazine editor is that if you want to scare people away, you should publish detailed, long pieces outlining plausible policy alternatives. Nobody wants anything to do with that. So since Johnny asked to make it exciting, I thought I would make an attempt to situate that in a somewhat more inflammatory critique of conservative economic orthodoxies and the sort of neoliberal economic consensus that has prevailed in this country since the end of the Cold War, at least. The key aspect of the problem we're facing is perhaps best summarized by a quotation from a recent MIT study. And I'm quoting, "From the beginning of 1989 to the end of 2017, $23 million of real equity wealth was created by the non-financial corporate sector. We estimate that 54% of this increase was attributable to the reallocation of rents to shareholders in a decelerating economy. Economic growth accounts for just 24%, followed by lower interest rates and a lower risk premium. From 1952 to 1988, less than half as much equity wealth was created, but economic growth accounted for 92% of it." To put that into political theory terms rather than economic study terms, one could say that the thinly secularized concept of the invisible hand is no longer just invisible, it is increasingly non-existent. We have, especially the conservative movement bears a special responsibility for this, but have essentially constructed an economy increasingly geared toward producing financial wealth for narrower and narrower segments of the population, rather than growing through productivity gains, innovation, and widespread improvements in real economic conditions. And the essence of this issue is that we have effectively set up an economy that prioritizes corporate profits, financial asset prices, and for anyone who doesn't benefit from the first two, cheap consumer goods. On the surface, this may not seem like such a problem. After all, who doesn't want to increase profits or the value of their assets? However, what we have effectively done is we have reallocated capital away from labor, away from the government sector, and we have essentially allocated more and more to the corporate sector under the promise that the main thing the private sector would do, and what they knew how to do, was allocate capital to investment. And all of the logic would have worked out fine, except that we took all these new corporate profits and we didn't actually want to invest them. Most of them just wound their way back into financial markets where they have been sterilely floating around and circulating and inflating the value of financial asset prices, which again benefits large capital holders, and anyone who is not able to participate in those rents was basically out of luck. To give this a more concrete example, we can look at trade policy, although one can apply this to most of economic policy in the United States, whether it's deunionization, whether it's shifting responsibilities for retirements and so on. But we'll talk about trade. The only thing I could say to supplement what you just mentioned is that no one was ever serious in NAFTA or anything else when they said that the real goal was to increase U.S. exports. Maybe some of the dimmer bulbs in the Koch network thought that this was true. Maybe they really believed in stuff like comparative advantage. No serious person did. The benefit that was going to come to U.S. from free trade was, one, yes, consumer prices, we all know that, but two, mainly and most decisively, was the increase in corporate profits that would result from labor, regulatory, and tax arbitrage. That, of course, is a benefit to the United States, and it could have been. And the promise was, well, we'll take this and we'll invest it, and you'll get all kinds of new jobs. You'll get all kinds of better jobs. We'll move up the value chain. It'll be great. Needless to say, that did not happen. Instead, and it was never going to happen because the investments were never made where you would create the conditions where this could happen. Instead, we created a few jobs in finance. The actual tech sector jobs were pretty stagnant. And most of the new jobs were created in low value-added service sector jobs. Low-skill healthcare, personal services, retail, at least for a while, and more recently being a sub-minimum wage Uber driver. More people are actually working as drivers today than are employed in any manufacturing sector. I think the inequality issues around this are pretty self-explanatory, and if you're not concerned about it now, you know, you're never going to be. But I think what I would like to say on this is that one element of industrial policy, it's not simply a question of focusing on the competitiveness issues, which I will do in the rest of this talk. But we could, there are many other elements of the wage issues and the inequality issues and the job issues that probably haven't really been addressed at this conference yet. But it's not simply that manufacturing jobs went overseas. The other parts of it, we also had deunionization and things like that. And you could theoretically take all these service jobs and you could unionize them. You could do various kinds of redistribution. There's about zero prospect of that happening, but it's theoretically possible. And even if we did do that, though, we would still have a problem because these jobs are notoriously low productivity jobs. You're simply not going to get the productivity growth from these jobs that we all know is the central condition for real economic and real wage growth. And even if it were possible to fix the redistribution issues through secondary redistribution, we would still have an uncompetitive industrial sector and a labor force largely moving down rather than up the value chain. That's one problem. The other issue, which I think now is becoming impossible to ignore, is the security implications of deindustrialization. We are, of course, increasingly sourcing essential network components from unreliable suppliers, as evidenced by the recent espionage scandals. We no longer really have the metallurgical technology to build submarines in the US. It's increasingly difficult to build aircraft without relying on Chinese suppliers, and that's even a relatively protected industry. In fact, I think the recent issues with Boeing are maybe one of the most crystallizing examples of what our economic policies have done and the effects on our competitiveness. Boeing has been outsourcing key elements of their design to Japan and elsewhere for years, and even more damning, as recently reported, they outsourced much of the software design involved in the 737 MAX, sort of easy software fix, to India, very low paid engineers. And what did they actually do with all these cost savings? About $20 billion of share buybacks. I don't think you can look at that and say financial market-driven capital allocation is really working well. But Boeing is hardly an outlier. A recent study showed that more and more of US corporate R&D is moving to Asia, which is where not only the manufacturing facilities are, but where the engineering talent increasingly is. It's no longer invent here, manufacture there. It's manufacture there, invent there. The US, of course, is a net importer of advanced technology products. China is well ahead of us in 5G and various kinds of precision manufacturing, and they're at least a peer competitor in things like AI, quantum computing, et cetera. And I'll just add, too, that there's this sort of canard about automation. Oh, the real problem is people are really just losing their jobs because of automation. It's exactly the opposite. The US lags most of the world in automation. Countries like South Korea, who are far more advanced in robotics and other automation technologies, have far more workers employed in manufacturing, and a far larger sector of their GDP, or a far larger component of their GDP, is manufacturing, and of course, they're producing much more they're much higher technologically capable manufacturing facilities. And the last thing I'll mention just on the diagnosis of the problem, which I don't think is always sufficiently appreciated, is simply that all of these dynamics create their own vicious cycle. Deindustrialization leads to widening trade deficits, leads to massive global financial and economic imbalances, leads to a bloated financial sector, further misaligning the incentive, increasing instability, and on and on. So what is to be done? The first thing is that we need to do, and which I commend the organizers of this conference for doing, is to leave behind these moralistic debates about the free market versus socialism or whatever. None of that has anything to say about the problems I just outlined. In fact, in many ways, it contributed to them and has nothing to offer in terms of solutions. Second, and this is maybe the only time I've ever been in a place where this point may be a little more controversial than the last one, is that we need to recognize the gravity of our economic situation and recognize that protectionism is actually not sufficient. Most people think protectionism is too radical. I would say it's not radical enough. Even if we fix the issues with the trade agreements and so on, we would still face the fact that Asia now has manufacturing capacities far more advanced, far more efficient than ours. We would still have crumbling infrastructure and a host of other problems. I certainly have no ideological objection to tariffs. I think they might play a role. But what we really need to focus on is not so much protecting what exists, but developing what we don't have, what Michael Lind calls a strategy of national developmentalism. What would this look like? I'll go through it fairly quickly. I mean, at a very basic level, we have a major funding gap in non-software startups and scale-ups. There was another excellent MIT study on this, went through several manufacturing, hardware-oriented new companies. All of them had pilot projects that were successful. All of them attracted initial investors. When it came time to scale up and actually start manufacturing this, there was no money in the US. But guess who was offering money? China and others in Asia, happy to lend them facilities, happy to find capital for them. There's lots of things that we can do about this, simply learning from what other countries have done with respect to commercial bank lending incentives, updating various programs that we already have, like the SBIR and SBIC programs. A lot of these are currently being contemplated in the reauthorization of the Small Business Administration coming up later this year. Other things we can do involve research spending. Corporate research has largely been outsourced to universities at this point. Things like Bell Labs do not exist. Not sure how great that is for the universities or the companies, but one group that it's definitely not good for is your small and medium-sized companies who have no way to have access to any of the innovations coming out of universities at Stanford or MIT or whatever. What has been done in Germany is create these sort of translational manufacturing institutes that work to sort of help commercialize these innovations and spread them out throughout the supply chains, the domestic supply chains, to small and medium-sized businesses that don't have any resources to be engaged in this. One could also envision more ambitious translational research institutes. Elizabeth Warren has proposed something for pharma in which you would basically have a federally organized research group which would invent new drugs and then license them to others. We could do the same thing for industrial technology as well. There's also just the actual government research budget. Thanks largely to the conservative movement, this has declined significantly as a percent of GDP. That at least can be easily reversed. Whether we can find the scientific talent to invest in is another question, but there's only one way to do that. The government should also use its procurement spending to foster needed companies in critical areas. The easiest example of this is, of course, Huawei. We're currently running around telling others not to use Huawei. We have no alternative to Huawei. And there's actually a very good precedent for this. We did the exact same thing in World War II when we created RCA, because the only other provider at the time, Marconi, was an Italian company. We eventually then destroyed RCA, but that's a different story. Another thing we need to consider is that we're now spending a lot more time talking about preventing China from stealing our technology. Pretty soon, I think we'll need to worry a lot more about how we're going to steal it from them. David Goldman, in particular, has written a lot about this in The Next Room, but there's no reason that the U.S. cannot require companies that want to do business here to have local partnerships and to do forced technology transfers. To respond to another point made earlier in this conference, there's no reason that we have to let American exceptionalism be an excuse for bad economic policy. And the key point to all this is that markets are inevitably structured by political choices, and they can be structured to achieve the ends that we want. We can do all kinds of different things in financial markets and other things to at least disincentivize unproductive financial engineering and increase the incentives for productive investments in the U.S. economy. Markets are not some jealous god that we have to make sacrifices to, and it's time we simply acknowledge that. And I realize I just said this with the word conservatism looming over me, so I just want to stress that this is absolutely nothing out of the ordinary in U.S. history. In fact, I hope many of you were around for Oren Cass's excellent presentation the other night. But one thing he said that I disagree with, and maybe sort of taken out of context, was that the U.S. hasn't tried industrial policy. No, the U.S. economy has been built on industrial policy forever. And you can go back to the early republic, you can go back to the Homestead Act, you can go back to Lincoln, you can go to World War II, you can go through the early days of Silicon Valley. But I'm not even going to ask you to do that. All you have to do is go back to one Ronald Wilson Reagan. And yes, Reagan cut taxes, and that's apparently the only thing we can remember about him. But he also massively increased government spending, specifically for these purposes, the research budget through the Defense Department. He negotiated voluntary import quotas with Japan and Germany. He negotiated the Plaza Accord, which is basically a currency adjustment mechanism. And toward the end of administration, the Reagan Defense Department even commissioned a technology-based industrial policy. In fact, the closest American analog to China's Made in China 2025 plan actually came out of the Reagan administration. So all I'm asking is for a party that has spent my entire life, at least, claiming the mantle of the blessed memory of Ronald Reagan, that they simply look at his real legacy. And just one final point, there has been a lot of talk lately about the domestic power of the large Silicon Valley companies. And I don't disagree with that, and I think it's very alarming. But in a way, the more interesting thing about them may actually be their global weakness. Despite all of the various kinds of cooperation and so on that they have done with China, Google, Facebook, Amazon are trivial players in China. They're trivial players in Russia. All these network effect businesses are heavily dependent upon a favorable political atmosphere. And as more and more, as China continues to grow into the dominant economic power in the world, and one could argue they're that already, as more and more of the world is brought into the Chinese orbit through One Belt, One Road, as more and more of the world becomes dependent upon core Chinese 5G and other infrastructure, does anyone actually think that all these people are going to be using Facebook and Amazon and Google? They're going to be using WeChat and Alibaba. And there's a sort of kind of condescending, self-rationalizing line that we hear a lot, and sometimes I think even quote-unquote populists adopt it as part of their own self-image, that this thing is about a sort of a revolt of the left behind, that it's just some people have been left behind and they need to be given some compensation because they can't compete in this brilliant meritocracy that we have. But I would actually argue that the short-sightedness of America's corporate elite, financial elite, affluent classes in general, in not understanding their own self-interest in industrial policy and all of these things, and sort of clinging to the last dregs of trade agreements and share buybacks and tax cuts, is nothing less than astounding. And in a way, populism or economic nationalism, whatever you want to call it, is perhaps, the last chance for them to be saved from themselves.